Look, it's great to see everybody, and it's always good to see faces. As I said earlier, we are recording this, so if you prefer that your face isn't visible on a recording, that's perfectly okay to leave your name in place there. If you are happy to let us see your face, that's always great too. We don't see as many people these days as we'd like to, so that'd be terrific. I want to start, first of all, by acknowledging that this workshop is run on the lands of the Wurundjeri Willam, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today is a day about building wicking beds. So I'm going to be as practical as possible. I'm not a scientist, so don't ask me too many technical questions, but any question you ask, I'll do my best to answer. So one good place to start might be to ask if anybody here has built a wicking bed yet. You can use that little hand-raising reaction in the bottom, down the bottom, just right of the middle of your screen if you want to. Nobody's built a wicking bed. Oh, yes, one. Good, we've got one wicking bed builder. And a not yet, great.
Mine was built for me and installed here.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yep, always nice to have them built for you because they can take quite a bit of work. So, over the years, I've built between 40 and 50 wicking beds directly and assisted in quite a few other ones. So what I'll be talking to you today is from a fair bit of experience. You'll notice that as I talk and as I show you the slideshow, that I actually have some preferences about the way that things work in wicking beds that are not always the same as other people. Feel free to question anything that I do. And if you're building a wicking bed, get the best information and make your own decisions. So, first of all, it's important to understand that a wicking bed is simply a way of delivering water from the bottom up towards the root zone of your plants. That's all it does. It just puts the water in a different place for your plants to access. Sorry, I'm having to let people in as we talk. So put very simply, it's a system for growing plants using water which wicks upward from a reservoir below the soil. So if any of you have ever had a self-watering pot for a pot plant, that's exactly the same principle. So it's a very simple principle, but it's an incredibly useful way of growing plants. So the water that's in the reservoir below wicks up. So we start off with the concept of a pond of water. Now, excuse my amateur sketches. So if you can just imagine a container that holds water as your first starting point. Now, I hasten to add, this is not the way you'd build it. I'm trying to get trying to put out the concept. So a pond of water, and that pond of water is going to be contained inside something, either timber or galvanized iron usually. There are other options, but most of those are not viable. So into that pond of water, you either put scoria, which is the most common way to approach this, or you use a system that I learned from Costa, which includes things called flow tanks that I'll show you later, with sand wrapped around them. So once you have your pond in place, you need to place what we call geotextile, which is simply, looks a little bit like weed mat, but it's a superior kind of material. So you can get it from Bulleen Art and Garden, for example. But all that it is a cloth which is made of polyurethane. And let me have a think. Polyurethane, yep. And it's needle punched. as opposed to some of the weed mat, which is woven. So I'm not a big fan of woven weed mat. Much better to have something which is needle punched. It doesn't come apart. It's a complete, you know, it forms a complete sheet that's very, very durable. So once you've got your pond of water and the geotextile sitting above, you've got an outlet and an inlet, very crudely drawn there. You'll see a little bit later what that really looks like. And once you've got the soil in there, you've got the water going in and you've got a water flow for any excess water going out, only for excess water. And of course, you've got a bunch of food growing in the top. So if we sit back for a minute and think about why you might grow plants in a wicking bed, the first and most obvious reason is that you use about half the water that you normally would, even using drip line. So the best methods to water are, first of all, wicking beds. Drip line is second, and in lots of places you're going to need to use drip line like we do. The other thing to say is that a wicking bed allows you to water far less frequently. So 1 to 2 times a week at most in the warmer weather. So you don't have, all you have to do there is top up the reservoir. In wicking beds, plants are often a lot healthier and they produce more because the water is the water is constantly available in the right kind of proportion. You know, the plants are able to take up the water in the way that they exactly want to take it up. The other thing we've noticed about wicking beds is they are incredibly good at helping you get through really scorcher days. So we rarely have any issue with the leafy plants in the very hot 40+ degree days. It seems that if they're well hydrated, they're very unlikely to scorch. Not impossible, but far, far less likely. The other thing to say is that we've always grown our vegetables in the wicking beds much closer together than we grow the plants that we've got into the ground. And our whole quarter-acre block is fruit trees and plants. And finally, the thing to say is that the roots are encouraged to grow deeper. So you have a more complete root system than you would in a lot of the soil. Now you can see the obvious advantages because if your soil is like ours here, it's you know, about maybe 50 to 100 millimetres of something that's a bit like soil, and then it's gravel and it's clay and it's all that kind of thing. So growing in a wicking bed means you can use exactly the kind of soil mix that you want to use. Now, if we just roll back a little bit and think about the way that we typically have a garden bed that's not a wicking bed, so just a standard garden bed, you've got contained inside there, you've got your soil, you might have gone to Bulling Art and Garden, bought some nice veggie mix, you've planted your plants, and maybe you wouldn't plant all those plants together at the one time, it's purely illustration, and then you water from the top. And whether you water with a watering can or a hose or even drip line, what's going to happen is the water has to try to find its way down to the root zone. And that's where it needs to be. So that water is going to have to penetrate from the top down into the root zone, which is where the plant can actually make use of it. At this point, I think it's worth getting on Robin. Most of you would know Robin, my wife. Her hobby horse on watering is that watering is about moistening the soil so that the plant roots can use the water, not watering the leaves. Watering leaves is a pointless exercise and simply wastes water. So what we're looking to do is get the water down to the root zone. But of course, that's a lot harder if you're doing overhead watering of any sort. So what a wicking bed does, and this is its absolute selling point, is that it supplies the water directly where the plants need it. So if you look at the cross-section of a pretty standard wicking bed, you'll notice a few things about it. First of all, The brown outer part is timber, or it could be galvanized iron. Whatever it is, it's a container of some sort. The dark blue line, you'll notice there, is pond liner. Now, a lot of people in the past have used things like builder's plastic. So that's the stuff you get from Bunnings. Pretty standard plastic, can be heavy duty. I would never use it. It's a recipe essentially for failure because it was never intended to hold water. And really the only thing, if you're going to go to the trouble of making a wicking bed, you need to use something effective like a proper pond liner. So there are a number of different kinds and grades of pond liner. Bulling Art and Garden, again, carry a couple of quite good ones. You can use, don't use PVC, polyvinyl chloride. That tends to go brittle, and there is some concern about it sending chemicals into the water. The best ones are the heavy-duty plastic that is specifically a pond liner, but I most of all prefer, having a blank moment, I most of all prefer synthetic rubber pond liner. So that's a basic. Would I line it with mud or clay? Okay, I'm going to hold that question for later. Can you ask that a little bit later, Jenna? So we've got a pond liner, that's the blue part. So what you can see down the bottom there is the reservoir, and I've filled that one with scoria. So what the scoria does in this wicking bed is it actually supports the soil, and that's basically all it does. That's all that scoria can really do. Now above the scoria, that black line, which goes all the way up to the top, that's the geotextile again. So remember I mentioned the geotextile. So the beauty of that is that water can penetrate it, but soil won't. So geotextile is used in lots of applications. It's often used in road making. So where they need to have water penetrate, but keep out soil and sand and so on. And above that, there's soil that the plants are growing in. So something like a good veggie mix that you get from the nursery. I'll talk a little bit about soil mixes later on. So essentially, I'll just run through it again. What you've got there is you've got a container, you've got a pond with pond liner holding the water, you've got geotextile above that separates the soil from the pond, you've got a water inlet, and you've got a water overflow. So the method that I prefer, and we've used at the Macleod Organic Community Garden, and it's the one I've mostly used in recent years, is a combination of flow tanks, which are the white boxes, surrounded by sand. Now, the nice thing about that method is two things. One is I've got the flow tanks and I know they're going to be full of water. They're like a block of water and I know their dimensions. And sand will also hold water, but what it does so well is it wicks. Now, when we talk about a wicking bed, the issue with the pond is that scoria does not wick. For water to wick upwards, and here we're thinking about, the analogy is, I don't know if you've ever used an oil lantern of any sort. What happens with an oil lantern is you have a wick at the top, you have a container of oil, usually some form of oil, and the oil will wick upwards. And so the wick then is able to ignite. Wicking through sand works really well because the water needs to move up. The water will only wick upwards if the particles are fine enough. And sand, of course, has very fine particles. So the kind of wicking beds that I used to make were made of, generally speaking, made of golden cypress. which is a recovered wood that comes out of the windbreaks of farms, those really massive, tall conifer type trees that you often see along roadways next to farms. Now, good quality golden cypress has some real advantages. It tends to resist weathering. It tends to resist even breaking down in the soil. My caution here would be that the more recent timber that people have been able to get, we think is a little bit young and not quite as resistant to weathering or to being in the soil. So you need to be a little bit cautious. The other option, the other thing I should say about golden cypress is it doesn't particularly need any treatment, although I'll come back to that later. So it has been the timber of choice, and a lot of people who are doing very good wicking beds use that. But it's not infallible, so worth keeping that in mind. So there's just 3 wicking beds. Those are at a good friend's place over in the other side of Macleod, across the line. And because she's an artist, I was laying out the wicking beds, and I go to a fair bit of trouble to get them completely level. She was standing back at the house, which was probably a good 50 metres back, and she said, "That end wicking bed isn't level." And when I went back and checked, it was out of level by less than half a centimetre. But I presume that was her artist's eye picking that up. But of course, I remedied that. Now, the nice thing is they produce a lot. So that's a wicking bed. What I've done with that one, that again is simply the golden cypress, or Macrocarp is the other name that we use for it. That's the part of the Latin name for it, Macrocarp or golden cypress. And what I've done there, because the client wanted it to be rat resistant, is to put some narrow profile galvanized iron on there so the rats would have more difficulty running up. Apparently it worked. I wasn't convinced that it was completely foolproof, but apparently it's worked quite well. That's the first wicking bed I ever made. That used to sit outside in our front garden. And the point about this one is to look at how much produce there is in the top. That's a lot of Asian greens. So what we found is that you can pack the plants in there. Because there's always as much moisture as they want, they tend to grow fine really close together. Sorry, that's not moving on for some reason. Excuse me while I just... There we go. That's one of our galvanized iron beds that I've got up the back at the moment. With that one, it's simply a galvanized tank without a bottom. And I was using those for a little while. Now, there are some advantages to a galvanized iron container because it comes ready-made. You don't have to put it together. The more recent ones I've used, and I'll show you a picture of them later, more recent ones I've used have bottoms in them already, but this one has the full pond liner, geotextile, and sand and flow tanks in the pond. So that's a close-up of the outlet. So for outlets, we use what are called tank outlets. They're very standard. You can get them at Bunnings or most hardware stores. And they have a screw thread, so they screw each side of the pond liner. Not concerned so much about the outer part, but they screw either side of the pond liner. And one of the things I want you to notice that I do, which is different from a lot of people who make them, is I've put the outlet at the top of the pond. So if you can imagine, there's the ground, then there's the bit of the wicking bed that's the pond. I've put the outlet right at the top of the pond. In other words, I've put it at the level, the highest level of the water, for a very simple reason. If I put it in the bottom, at ground, essentially at ground level, like a lot of people prefer to do, the danger is that unless I seal it absolutely perfectly, I'm going to have a leaking bed. And I'm not a big fan of leaking beds, because what you usually end up doing is either being very disappointed with the way it works, or you end up pulling it all apart and doing something differently. I'll talk a little bit later on about the reasons why people do that, and a little bit more about why I do it my way. So these root vegetables are one of the reasons why I love Wicking Beds. Well, the absolute king, queen, prince, whatever, of methods for producing really high quality root vegetables. They'll grow if you've got the right kind of soil, if you haven't put the wrong kind of manures and so on in, you'll get wonderful root vegetables, absolutely brilliant stuff. And leaf vegetables too, of course. So the nice thing about wicking beds, if you're building them, is you can actually invite a few people around to help you. So these were the very first wicking beds we did at Macleod Organic Community Garden. And we found that by running a workshop, people can acquire skills, but they also build the wicking beds for you, which, believe me, is great, because they can be a lot of work if you're starting from scratch like these are. So you can notice that it's a very simple timber construction. They're simply standard 2.4 metre sleepers, but they could be longer, they could be shorter. And those are then cut in half for the end sleepers, and you just use other sleepers as the vertical sections to join them together. The screws we use there are called bugle batten screws. They're a galvanized screw. If you want to get more technical about it, just ask me later, and I can always answer any questions by email, of course. Quite happy to do that. So the boxes are together, looking pretty neat. We've lined them up, and they're ready to start working. Now notice there's nothing in the bottom. So Macleod Organic Community Garden is built on old tennis courts. So what's underneath there is in fact fine scoria, because that's what the older en-tout-cas tennis courts were made of. This is a slightly different style of wicking bed that I made. That's probably 6 or more years ago. And you'll notice that there's some sand in the bottom of the front wicking bed. So what I would do is I would put about 25 millimetres, a couple of centimetres of sand onto the ground, and then lay the sheet of pond liner over that. Reason for that is that it provides, sand is a very stable kind of material, and once you've laid it over that, you can tell whether there are any things that are going to pierce the pond, and it also makes it nice and smooth and level and so on. So the same job from a slightly different angle. What I did with these ones that I wouldn't do now is put a cross piece across the middle there. That's was to stabilise, but I found that it's not necessary to do that. The timbers usually are quite able to stay straight and level and so on without that. So this again is the first wicking bed ever. It was in our front yard. So on that one, of course, I used scoria because that's what you did. Now, one of the reasons I don't use scoria anymore, you can see there, it's not, I should add, it's quite feasible to use it. It's simply not my preference. What you'll notice there is there are high bits and there are low bits. So the high bits are stones and the low bits are water. So when the geotextile sits on top of that, what's happening is that some of the soil is touching water, which I prefer it not to do, and some of it's slightly out. Now, it'll still work, it'll still produce vegetables and so on, and do quite well. But what I found with the sand is you can create an incredibly level surface that sits against the geotextile and the soil, And the water isn't in a pool. The water is simply moving upwards through the sand. So it's a very even, damp, but not wet mix with the soil. I prefer not to have the soil sitting in actual water. So this was an installation I did using the flow tanks. Now, what you can see, those white blocks. So Jenna, I'll come back to your question later. So with the flow tanks, what I've done there is wrap them in geotextile. That's a nice white, that's an Italian geotextile, that one, very fine, very nice one. And what I'll do is I'll add sand in there around and between the flow tanks, and just 50 millimetres, try and do, that's about 50 millimetres above there, so that the geotextile above and the sand and the soil is simply touching sand. Now I also have to add an outlet and an inlet, and with the flow tanks, and you can see the bits of the flow tank that are not put together just sitting on the edge there. You need to put the inlet down into one of those flow tanks. So there's a bit more engineering involved. You need to be careful that the sand doesn't get into the flow tanks and muck things up. So there's the Eltham crew doing the wicking beds on Eltham Station that we did. They're just about to wrap the flow tank. As I said, this was a method that Costa put me onto from the days when he was actually a representative for the firm that produces the flow tanks. It's a company called Atlantis. They're an international, multinational, whatever they are, company. And these flow tanks in that size and larger sizes are used in where they want to retain water in ponds. So you'll often see development these days retaining water that's taken from the roof. What they do is they take the flow tanks and they stack them and they surround them, put them into essentially a pond and allow them to hold the water. They're so strong that when they do them in large installations, in sports fields and so on, they can drive a truck over it. They're pretty tough. So there's back to our our wicking bed workshop again. People are putting the sand around the flow tanks. As you can see, many hands make light work, but it's still a big job. And just placing the geotextile. Sorry, there's an acute over the E, Geotextile, because it's a French word originally. So just bringing the geotextile right up to the top so that the soil doesn't leak down into the pond, because you don't want that soil above getting into the water. You'll also notice the outlet there's dripping a bit of water. We've filled it up already just to make sure that we had all the levels correct. And the final bit almost is putting the soil in. So this is a veggie mix that we would have got from Bulleen Art and Garden. You can use something like that. You can make up your own mix. Key thing with the soil that goes in is that you don't put fresh manures in. So compost, manure that's very dry and aged, like cow manure often is, that's not as potent as something like chicken manure. Anything you put in there needs to be less potent than manures that you might put on your open ground. Oops, wrong one. And there's a lot of satisfaction in finishing a job with a group. So that was a day's work, and that was a pretty hefty day's work, but I think we enjoyed it and a great result. Jenna, you're asking me questions at the moment. It's hard for me to answer those right now. I'm happy to come back to those later. So wicking beds can come in all sizes. That was a very small one. That's, I think, only about 1.5 metres long. and about half that wide. Roughly with wicking beds, good proportion is the width is half of the length, and that works easily. But, you know, there are things to remember, such as, you know, how far do you need to reach to work on the wicking bed, work on the plants. You also need to think about, I can't remember, I had another thought, but there you go. Whoops, sorry about that. Kicked it right out. Yep, so that was a neat little one I did. This was a much more recent installation. I think this was about 2018. Now, a couple of things about that. First of all, the person who lived there really wanted wicking beds. And they really had some specific requirements, such as they needed a space. If you see the four that are grouped together, there's an open space there that is, I haven't counted how many sides it would have, it's octagonal or something like that. That was a lot of work. Did that all myself, which is probably one of the reasons why I no longer do it commercially. But that was enjoyable because it was such a complete piece of work. You'll also notice that on top of the wicking beds, there's a plinth, that timber that's across the top sitting horizontally. That's a really useful thing if you're making a timber wicking bed, because it, first of all, you can sit on it or you can rest your tools on it, but also it protects the edges of the timber that's uppermost. I'm going to pause in a moment and actually take some of those questions. Just get to, yep. So those wicking beds you saw being built in the workshop, that's what they look like after 5 years, which is a little while ago, a couple of years ago, I think. So you notice the timber, because we haven't treated it, it's gone grey. You can, of course, oil it so that it keeps more or less its original colour. But certainly adding the plinths is a good idea. Okay, and that, in fact, is the slideshow. So I might take some questions now. So Jenna, I just have to get to the chat and see what those questions were. So Jenny, you asked if we could line it with mud or clay. Where would you do that?
Hi, sorry, I was just wondering if there's like natural ways to waterproof it.
Look, there are some clays that might do the job, yeah, but how you would access those and, you know, how you'd get them in there, I'm not sure.
Okay.
It would be hard work, but it's a fair point, because the kind of pond liner that really is worthwhile is very expensive. On a bed like most of the ones I showed you there, you're spending around $300 just for the pond liner. Yeah. So big investment.
What about like concrete, like lining it with concrete?
Theoretically, you could.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. But you'd need to know what you're doing. Concreting, even simple bricklaying, is a hard job. I know because I've done it. Concreting an actual tub, that's pretty specialist work, I think. What other questions? Jenna, you asked why. Oh, mixing scoria and sand. Yes, theoretically you could. I'm not sure why you'd want to, unless you wanted to do away with the boxes, with the Atlantis flow tanks. Yeah, you could do that.
The why was in terms of manure, like what, or compost. What about why don't you want to use compost or manure when you're?
Oh, compost or manure.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yes, use compost by all means. So now we're talking about what you actually put into the growing part of the bed.
Yeah.
So yes, really high quality compost. Absolutely.
But why not manure? Because you said don't use like.
So don't use manure, because what will tend to happen is that the manure will work its way down into the bed. The water will, you know, rain and other actions will send it down into the bed. You're more likely to have a pond that gets a bit stinky. And that's a good point to talk a little bit about things that people worry about. So one of the reasons that people put an outlet right at the very bottom at ground level is so they can simply drain the pond if they're worried about what's in the pond. I have to say, though, in all the years I've done the work, I've never had a problem with anybody's pond becoming stinky or anaerobic. And in fact, it can't become anaerobic because you have an inlet as well as an outlet. And as the pond level drops, air's drawn in. So by definition, it shouldn't be anaerobic unless you've done something extraordinarily wrong. And you can always siphon out the tank. You can always flush it through. The point is, for me, that you avoid the danger of having a leaking wicking bed. And that's that. I'm a big fan of not having failure. So did I answer that question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Barb, you've got a question there, a rather long one. You've had a wicking bed which produces well for about 5 years. The lower timbers are bulging. Is it, do you know if it's golden cypress?
I don't know. I was thinking that when you were talking about it. I think it could be. They have. I think it's more likely to be something else though, because they're weathered, but they're not weathered as grey as your golden cypress were at the centre. So I don't think so from that point of view. They've weathered a bit, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, if the lower timbers are bulging, it suggests that are they screwed in with something like those bugle batten screws that I suggested?
Yeah, I don't know that either.
Pretty large.
I didn't do the work myself. I was the lazy one looking on. Yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Tricky question. If it's bulging, it's hard to know. Maybe they'll continue to bulge. But it does suggest that somehow the box, the actual container has lost integrity. So I'd imagine that, look, what'll often happen with timber is that the screws will pull out as things deteriorate. And really that's down to, first of all, the kind of fixing is used in the first place, and secondly also the kind of timber. Another option for timber, and I know people are not big fans of it, but another option is to use treated pine, which is actually probably superior in lasting quality to Macrocarp, much more predictable. And to be frank, when I use Macrocarp, I've always had to sort through the stack in the nursery and chuck out all the bits that are just very poor quality. They've had some terrible stuff, and that's no comment about Bulling Art and Garden, who are very happy for me to for me to do that, bless them. But it does seem like there's some inferior milling going on.
I thought these might have been treated pine, but they have weathered somewhat. It's also a square box, not a...
Square's fine.
Yeah.
My first one was essentially square.
I'm pretty sure it hasn't got anything. It's probably 1 metre by 1 metre, maybe.
Yeah,
maybe a bit
so
bigger.
not so big.
Not so big, but it produces well.
Yeah,
I just noticed that this is
great.
on the side of the most bulging timber is on the side of the outlet. Don't know whether that means anything.
No, well, yeah, good question. Look, I wouldn't take it apart unless it was looking like it wasn't going to work. Give it another summer at least.
Yeah, okay.
But if it's only around about 1 metre by 1 metre, then it won't be quite so bad to pull it apart.
No, it's a bit of work, but still, okay. Thank you.
Indeed. So the idea there is to see who you can recruit.
Yes.
You could have your own wicking bed workshop,
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul.
So just going to, Mark, I can see your hands up. I'll just quickly look at what the questions people have put in the chat. In-ground wicking beds, reservoir under the soil. Yes, that's a possibility. I've never done it. Colin Austin, interestingly enough, the wicking bed is a product, it was originally developed by a guy called Colin Austin, who's one of those maverick kind of people. and you've got to be a bit careful if you check out his website, because he has some really interesting ideas that I would hesitate to use about putting vegetation matter in the pond itself, which I'm not a big fan of. But he'd started to develop in-ground wicking beds too for large-scale application. And so you can imagine in an orchard, if you can, dig a long, wide, deep trench and line that, collect water in there, which then moves outwards towards the tree roots, you might really be onto something. If I was redoing our orchard, I'd probably have a shot at that. So yeah, by all means, you can. Just think about, if you can, if you're digging into the soil, where's the water going to get to the plant roots? So think about that part. If what you're trying to do is to plant directly into that as a wicking bed, yes, that should work. You just need to kind of picture it as though it is a raised bed. What do you need to do to make it equivalent to that? So first of all, it'll be hard to achieve an outflow. So you might have the danger of it flooding and staying flooded, which a lot of plants won't like. But, because it's probably low cost, it's worth giving it a shot. And if you can find some really good clay, maybe you could line it with that. So, Rhonda, you're also saying you're looking at building under and near big trees. Yes. Wicking beds are one of the ways that you can get over the problem of trees like eucalypts without actually chopping them down. The roots shouldn't pierce the liners, but, and I don't have the photos here at the minute, but what they can do is they can go up beside the liner and the box, like internally, and then over the top. I had to pull apart a wicking bed. In fact, those first three you saw, the bottom one was attacked by a fig. And if you know what figs are like, they're huge chasers of water, and it just created absolute devastation in there. Also allowed weathering to get into the timber, between the timber and the pond liner. So they shouldn't pierce the pond liner, but they may well avoid the pond liner and just go right over the top if you're not watching closely. How do you go about levelling when you're building on a slope? A lot of hard work. You just got to dig it out. You bench it in other words. So cut away. If your slope's that, you cut in, you got to remove all that soil because you really want it level. Hugel culture inside a wicking bed. That's essentially, Jenna, what Colin Austin is doing inside some of his wicking beds. By all means, try it. Just a little bit cautious about how well that's going to work. You're introducing some other factors in there. May work really well. I'd do it on a small scale first if you're thinking about doing that. And yes, Rhonda, you were thinking about a reservoir under the soil and a bed above. Yep. You just need to figure out the dynamics of that. Marg, you've got your hand up and you've been very patient. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. I just want to, you mentioned in the beginning about some of the beds were lined with timber at the base, which sits on the soil, and then other ones haven't. Do you always make them without a base now? And if you do put them with timber underneath, I mean, what sort of life do you expect the timber to last?
So I've never built one with timber underneath. So the way that I've always built them is just with the sides, okay, sitting straight on the ground. With the galvanized iron ones, we've got two up the back which don't have a base, and we've got three new ones that do have a base. So they're essentially, they're water tanks.
Yeah.
They're manufactured in the same way that you would manufacture a water tank. And frankly, to get a 2 metre by 800, I think it is, no, 2 metre by 1 metre wide, costs about probably less than half what it would cost. Sorry, not quite that much. it can cost considerably less than building it out of timber with a pond liner. The pond liner being the very expensive part of it. So that's what I would choose now. A lot less work and good result. We like ours. I'll show you a little video in a short while about those galvanized iron beds too. Yep. So they've got a base in, so they don't need pond liner. They're already sealed.
Okay. Thank you.
So maintaining the soil fertility. Great question. Great question. Compost. So each time we've taken out vegetables, we put in compost. And we haven't found we've really needed to supplement that. If the compost is good enough, and ours contains a lot of chicken manure because we compost what the chooks do, that should be more than enough. Now, for some plants, you may want to add a little extra something, but be careful. Use something like pellets, like low nitrogen pellets. Don't put too much nitrogen in. But by and large, what we've found is that the plants, because they have the optimum water, need far less of anything that we would think of as fertiliser. So you might use a little bit of sea salt, prefer sea salt to the other one whose name I can't remember. You can leaf spray, foliar spray, that's great, but we're trying to avoid rich materials going down into the pond, where first of all, they won't be much use to you, but also they could create a situation that's unpleasant. And Patricia, I think you're asking me if the galvanized iron ones come with outlets. Good question. They do, but what the manufacturing guy does is he puts a hole right down at ground level. So when I order them, I ask for them not to have a hole in, and I drill the hole myself up where I want it to be, right at the top of the water level. Any other questions? Okay, what I'll do is I'll show you quickly a little video. Oh, Marg, you got your hand again. There you go.
Sorry. Yeah, just thought of another one. The optimum depth of the soil part.
Good.
Please.
The standard thing has been 250 to 300 millimetres, and that works for pretty much every annual vegetable you're going to use. So the standard one is, if you're using timbers, it's 600 millimetres high, so three standard 200 millimetre sleepers, and half of that is pond and half is soil. Now, of course, your soil level drops, which is why topping it up each year is important. The tool you use to make the hole is a hole saw, and which, will go through timber relatively easily, but it will scream like anything when you put it through metal. Just grit your teeth and do it. It won't last for long because the metal's very, very thin. Flow tanks, the place to get those is from the G store. That's just G, the letter G store in near Chadstone on whichever highway, Princess Highway, I think it is there. So going that path, even though that's my favourite, I have to admit it is a more expensive way to go. But if you're going to do it that way, it's the preferred way. Okay, good. So there's a guy who makes them for Ballina, can drill the hole higher in the crest. Okay, if you can get him to drill it where you want it, that's great. Otherwise, just done it myself. I'll show you a video now. Just did this morning, very rough. Thought I should have something to show you. So let's share the screen. Okay, so we can get that full screen. Yep. So what you're looking at there is one of the tanks that has the base already in it, and you can see where I've located the the outlet. And you can see how much trouble I've gone to putting silicone, that's just standard silicone that comes in a tube, to really seal that, because in this case, the galvanized iron is the pond. There's nothing beyond that except water and sand and so on. Another thing that's worth thinking about if you're going to all this trouble, there we go. Another thing to think about if we're going to this trouble is how you finish the top. Stop. So what you can see there, that black material, that's a thing called pinch weld. Now, again, I'll have to admit it's an expensive option, but I like things to be done reasonably neatly. What I've done there is I've got some of the pinch weld from Clark's rubber. So pinch weld it's like metal covered by a synthetic rubber. It's the stuff they use around the edges of car doors, or they certainly used to in the older ones. Can't remember what the newer ones look like. So that actually holds the little bit of white you can see there that I've trimmed very roughly is the geotextile that's holding the soil separate from the pond. So it's a reasonably neat solution, I think. And you can see the geotextile going down there to the soil. So the soil level's dropped a little bit, as it will. And the other nice thing about these kits that I've been mentioning is they come with a large inlet. The nice thing about that is that you can take a peek down there to see the level of your water. And if any spiders are in there and stuff like that. So looking at one of our other wicking beds, stop it. So we've just started putting in carrots now. Obviously these are really small. They're only about 1.5 centimetres high at the moment, the smaller ones. Now, what's going to happen in time is that they'll be able to make use of the water in the pond, but at present, the water's going to find it quite hard to get up there through 200 odd millimetres of soil. So at least in the very beginning, if you've put in tiny seedlings or even seeds like these, what you need to do is overhead water. So until the roots are established, they need a bit of overhead watering, not too much. And I'll just quickly finish that by showing you how we put, there it is. Okay, so you can see that one of the disadvantages of using galvanized iron is you can't fix anything onto the side very easily. So all I've done is I've hammered very roughly some PVC pipe into the ground and then got some electrical conduit and hooped that over. So that's what covers our netting over the top of the wicking beds. Very, very crude, very simple solution, and it works, but you're welcome to make up your own. So I'll pick up some more questions on the chat. How much approximately are flow tanks and fabric? Geotextile is actually quite cheap. That's not terribly expensive at all. It's only a few dollars a metre. The flow tanks, the ones I was showing you, around somewhere between $20 and $30 these days. Does the sand come out the outlet? No, I make sure that my outlets, if it's with a flow tank, goes into the end flow tank. So the inlet is into a flow tank, and then at the other end, if I can figure out which way I'm going, at the other end, the outlet goes straight again into the flow tank itself, or you can cover it with mesh. Yep, so sand is a bit tricky. It's going to try and find its way out if it possibly can. So finding a way to stop that happening is a good idea. Okay, so that was that little video. Are there any more questions at the moment? What sort of sand? Fine or coarse? Washed sand. Bulling Art and Garden generally don't have river sand. They have sand that's mined inland, and that sand works well. Don't get fat sand. So fat sand is that very yellowy looking sand that is used in bricklaying. So don't use that. What you want is just fine washed sand.
Why not use that kind of sand?
It's got other stuff than sand in there, which is why it's called fat. Don't ask me what else is in there. I'm not the expert, but it will be messy to use. It's a bit like mixing clay and sand. So it'll be fine. Does the geotextile degrade over time? Yes, in about 200 years. So another caution about wicking beds is, of course, some, excuse me a moment. So another caution about wicking beds, of course, is they do use synthetic materials. And if that's not your things and you prefer to do something else, I think that's quite understandable. And they cost money. What I would say, though, is that our experience with wicking beds tells us that the cost is worth it. And because you're producing so much of your own food, we think that a small amount of, some use of synthetic materials is warranted. But, again, that's a personal choice. That's just what we've chosen to do. Some other things about it too, what you can grow and so on. I strongly recommend you don't put perennials in there. Some people like to, but for me, it's a real waste of a resource, real waste of a system, because they work best and most productively when you're using annual plants, either root vegetables, leafy vegetables, garlic. We grow garlic in there. Anything like eggplants, any of the cabbage family will go really well in there. But perennials just take up a lot of space. They'll put down a lot of root, and basically you're not getting much of a return. So if you're investing in a wicking bed, what you really need to think about is, what's my return on this? The old return on investment is what makes sense. Could we use wool carpet? I wouldn't tend to. My sense is that would possibly break down. I'm not the expert on that. You might want to do your own experiments. Imagine you mean use that in place of geotextile. My suggestion there is that, unless it's because it's synthetic that you're worried, geotextile is so cheap that I wouldn't bother. So how are we doing with questions? Okay, so into maintaining it, what I'm going to do is send around some sheets that I have that will show you how to use wicking beds, but also how to build one. But I think it's worth thinking just a little bit further about how you maintain them. So the way they work best is if you're doing relatively rapid turnover of annual vegetables, you're working with them close together. They're easiest to use if you can more or less harvest it in one go. Now, obviously not practical if you've got, 500 carrots, but if you can do something like that, or if you can do it sequentially so that you can fill back with some extra compost. So putting compost back in once you've harvested part or all of that crop is a good way to go. In terms of keeping the water up to it, don't get too frantic, because even if the water level drops, the water will still move upwards. Even in a scoria bed, you'll still get some movement of water upwards. So they can run relatively dry and still be quite useful for the plants. But, obviously it's useful to keep them topped up. The outlet that's set at the top of the water level obviously tells you when you're filling up that you've reached that level, because it'll start to run out, and you might want to put a pot plant or something under there to catch that, as we do, to avoid wasting water. I think I've covered most of the maintenance there that I can think of. Would I use IBC tanks? So IBCs are those large 1,000 cubic meters, 1,000. Hang on. It's basically a big block of water that they use in all kinds of industrial applications. If you're using those, make sure you only choose ones that have had food grade material in, because they're used for carrying all kinds of stuff. And if it is food, make sure that if it's lecithin, which is often carried in them, that you really flush that out very thoroughly, or it'll affect your outcome. Thing to do with them generally is to cut them roughly in half, but then think about how you're going to get the outlet in there, how you're going to get the inlet as well. So I think I've covered pretty much everything that I can think about. Any last questions? That's been a pretty rushed go through. Because we're recording this, of course, you can go back and look at it on YouTube. And if you have any follow-up questions, I'm always very happy to answer those as well. Email is preferable to phone. So no more questions? Gosh, that was too simple. Look, it's been a real pleasure seeing you all. And if you're planning to build a wicking bed, trust it goes well. Feel free to throw questions at me if you're halfway through one, even. But if you want my recommendation, very simple. Use one of the galvanized iron beds kits that you can get from Bulleen Art and Garden. They've got all the parts except the Geotextile, which you can buy from Bulleen, and of course the veggie mix as well. We support Bulleen Art and Garden because they've been such good supporters of sustainable Macleod and the community garden. And I know the people that know the guys there well, the guys and the women, the people. They're really well trained, they're great to work with, so always happy to take their advice. Okay, we have a follow-up question. Level. What to do when the level of a bed changes because of complication? Not quite sure what that means, Marina. So all that I can make out there is that you start with a level bed, it ought to stay level. Not sure what the complication would be. Compaction. Compaction of the soil underneath, is that what you're suggesting? Well, if it's not too severe, I wouldn't worry too much about it. If it is severe, you might have to take the thing apart. Maybe not a lot else that you can do, depending on the type of bed you've got. And is it important for it to be level? It's not. It's not going to stop it working, but the more level a bed is, the more effective and the better it'll work. And you know, the aesthetics of a level bed are always preferable to something that looks wonky. And as our artist friend pointed out, it can drive some people crazy if it's not level. What do you put the galvanized bed on? Okay, good question. That'll depend what you've got underneath. You want a nice level ground. You want to clear any stones and soil. I wouldn't put it on stones necessarily. I'd tend to put it on sand. Sand is a nice stable material. You might want to dig slightly down into the soil to contain the sand a bit, but sand makes a really good bed. Recycled fruit crates. Do you mean the polystyrene ones?
No, I mean the really big wooden ones that are like a meter, like 1.2 meters.
Oh, sorry, yes, yes,
like a meter high.
Yes, I know what you mean. Look, we used to use those. We had a couple here. The problem with those fruit crates is they were never intended to be used outdoors. The thing that mostly goes wrong with them is the corner pieces of timber rot through. You'll also notice most of them are actually nailed with non-galvanized nails, and they tend to, pardon me, fall apart. And if you've got one that's lasted for a long time, Marina, that's fine. Go ahead and use it, but I would tend to go for something that's a bit more long-lasting. As I say, though, they can be used. If you can protect the top of it, particularly, then you'll get more use out of it. Okay, so look, please feel free to send any follow-up questions through to me on the sustainablemacleod@gmail.com address. You'll have got that from the notification about the workshop. I will send through some sheets about wicking beds that might be useful to you. And meanwhile, if you're building a wicking bed, enjoy it. And if you can get some people to help you, especially to fill it, that's a bonus. So good to see you all, and we'll sign off.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.